Hey, everybody. It's a Jimmy Dore show. I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy here at the Americans comedian Kurt Metzger. And this is the news out of Syria. As we're recording this, the death toll from the powerful earthquake that struck southern Turkey and northern Syria last week has crossed 35,000. And by the time many people are watching this, the toll will be even higher. Now, a major problem for Syria in terms of its ability to rebuild is that it's just been through a decade-long dirty war, where the U.S. and its allies spent tens of billions of dollars to produce the most well-armed insurgency in history, the sectarian death squads that were armed by the U.S. and its allies to overthrow the Syrian government. And this war, which is one of the most expensive programs from the CIA ever, left a lot of Syria in ruins. And making that even worse is that after the war wound down, the U.S. imposed these harsh sanctions under something called the Caesar Act, which explicitly target Syria's ability to rebuild. And the best person to explain this, I think, is this woman. Her name is Dana Stroul. She's now the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense handling the Middle East at the Pentagon. And back in 2019, she was the head of a congressional study group focusing on Syria. And she explained back then what U.S. policy was when it comes to sanctions and how they prevent Syria from rebuilding, which she explicitly said was the goal. Listen to what she said.
The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So that's the official U.S. policy as articulated by a top Pentagon official. Syria is in rubble, and our policy is to hold a line on preventing reconstruction. And the U.S. can do that through sanctions. And that was the policy back in 2019, and it remains the policy today, although it's shifting a little bit in the aftermath of the earthquake. And so Syrians are desperate for help and are pleading to the U.S. to lift these sanctions. So this is the head of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, who is issued a plea to the U.S. to lift the sanctions on Syria. And I will translate some of what he said. He says, the economic sanctions imposed on our country are the main obstacle to getting machineries to dig people out of the rubble. With this, we demand for the lifting of the economic sanctions and the siege in order to allow aid deliveries and humanitarian actions to be implemented by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and other bodies. We appreciate the deep desire of the people to provide help, but first we need the international community and the European Union to lift the sanctions. So that's the appeal from the head of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, saying that sanctions are hindering Syria's recovery effort. And this is the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations speaking about just one aspect of how sanctions hurt aid recovery inside of Syria.
How these sanctions hinder the humanitarian access? I'll tell you very simple that a lot of the cargo airplane refuse to land on Syrian airports because of the American and European sanctions. So even those countries who want to send humanitarian assistance, they cannot use the airplane cargo because of the sanctions.
That's just one aspect of this. So if you are a airliner and you want to land in Syria, you're not going to do it because if you do it, you're at risk of being sanctioned by the U.S. because these U.S. sanctions target anybody doing business with Syria, explicitly in the area of reconstruction, as Dana Stroul bragged about. So that's the policy. Now, the U.S. has walked it back a little bit. This is the headline in The Guardian. U.S. announces 180-day exemption to Syria sanctions for disaster aid. How nice of the U.S. to lift its sanctions for 180 days to let some aid come in to an earthquake-ravaged country. And what this is also is an admission that their sanctions do hurt the Syrian people. And this is Powell Wargan on Twitter. He's with the Progressive International. He says, what is this but an admission of what both the U.S. and EU regimes have vehemently denied? the sanctions act as an obstacle to humanitarian aid. Exactly. If you have to lift sanctions in order to allow humanitarian aid, you're admitting that the sanctions before this were an obstacle to humanitarian aid, which is something that the U.S. and its allies have always denied. And it's not even clear, by the way, what these exemptions will actually accomplish. We'll see. So far, many people who work in aid in Syria are not very confident that these exemptions will mean anything. And people, ordinary people, wanting to send money to their relatives still have a very, very hard time doing that because of the U.S. sanctions that prevent banking transactions between the rest of the world and Syria. And here's another aspect of this. Britain offered $2.7 billion in arms to Ukraine and just $6 million in disaster relief for 23 million people in Turkey and Syria. Is this for real? Apparently, yes. So we will see whether or not these sanctions exemptions that the U.S. has announced will have any impact. At minimum, though, it's an admission that U.S. policy to date has been to deny aid to Syrians, to deny them the supplies that they need to rebuild, because if they had access to those goods before, why would the U.S. now need to allow them to access them? And it's also an admission that for all the talk about the U.S. standing up to authoritarianism around the world, there's no bigger authoritarian than a government trying to block vital supplies to people who live around the world. Nobody in Syria voted for Antony Blinken or Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Mike Pompeo. But yet these leaders grant themselves the right to deny ordinary Syrians the right to live. And there's nothing to me more authoritarian than that.
Well, I mean, remember how we killed like 250,000 Iraqis, but it was worth it? Madeleine Albright said that.
That's right. That's right. It's the same policy today.
Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets and become a premium member. Get access to all our content.